Our first session is When Tech Policy Becomes Foreign Policy, the Future Global Governance of AI. Please welcome our speakers to the stage.
Good morning. Welcome. It's great to see this engaged auditorium here in London to talk about AI governance. I am Gina. I'm joined by a fantastic panel, and we have the next hour together to think about what can be done in this particular moment with this particular set of constraints around how we can get AI governance right. And I'm joined by a great group. These questions are quite urgent. And as the video we just saw explains, the stakes are high. So let's dive right in. Mark, there's a question that everybody has been asking over the last year since the Bletchley summits. We built the internet on a set of open principles, on the idea that everybody in the world could be connected. Why is that sense of openness so important right now to address in AI governance?
Well, we think at Mozilla that it is incredibly important to have a sense of openness, not just in AI governance, but watching this video, like how it all plays out. And one of the things we're obsessed with right now may sound very small and very boring, which is how do we find, and that's not necessarily for us to build, the next Linux, the next Wikipedia, the next Firefox. And we ask that because when you think about the internet, and actually let me just do the audience poll quickly. Yep. How many people think the internet is a hot mess? Just put up your hand.
Okay, and for the record,
all right.
It wasn't everybody in the auditorium.
Yeah, no, exactly.
But it was many.
I was surprised. And then how many people think that because it's a hot mess, we should just shut it down altogether?
Who's ready to give up the internet?
So I think,
And for the record, right, for those who are seeing the video later, nobody raised their. I didn't see a single hand. Anybody want to raise a hand? There's one. Okay, one good. Wants to shut it down. Let's applaud her in the back.
And I think that, I kind of asked that question because the internet is a hot mess, and I certainly don't want to get rid of it. And it has many good things in it. And I guess one of the ways that I think about it in terms of how to pull apart what's good, what's bad, and then how do we actually maximize the good, and what have we actually done okay at, is to go back to the fact that the internet is not run by one of these kind of centralized agencies, although CERN was helpful in starting the internet. It is this very weird thing that shouldn't work. It's this weird mix of public, private, nonprofit, this kind of evolving thing. I think the best metaphor I've ever heard for the internet is a city, where you have public spaces, private spaces, planning rules. And so why do we think that openness is so critical as we move into the AI era of the internet? Because that balance between things that are there in the public interest, things that are commonly owned, like open source software, and private interest, private innovation, is a part of what makes it work. Mm-hmm. And figuring out how to balance the good and the bad, figuring out how to actually make sure that it's not all privatized or all public, that's the job of living in it, just like the job of living in a city. So I think the worry now, though, as we go into this era, is we may be ceding in this, not just the generative AI era, but with AI overall, everything to the private actors. And that's why we put out a paper recently, and a lot of our work is focused on what we call public AI. We need a public option. Open source is at the core of a public option. We need public goods as a balance to what's happening privately in AI. So that's really a big focus of ours. Imagine if our cities only had private cars and there was no transit. I mean, that's the world of AI we're building. So I think openness is at the core of there being a balance of a public part of our digital society, and we really worry that that's missing as we go into the next era, despite the fact we know from the internet that it's an essential element.
Well, that's a great segue into Jennifer and the work that you do in countries around the world in really thinking about AI on the ground, AI outside of the US and Europe, outside of China. Why is it so important to take that grounded approach to AI governance right now?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for inviting us to join this panel. Thanks very much for the organizers of this. I think this is such an incredibly important conversation as we find engagement around the world, as the world is clamoring to have the benefits of AI. There's a lot of concern, of course, about the downstream negative consequences, but we find internationally is that everybody is in a rush to get access to AI. They all want to see the opportunities that AI brings. And so how AI is implemented on the ground around the world will ultimately, in my opinion, affect how it's viewed internationally. So do you have those guardrails? Do you have the conversations around ethics, discrimination, bias, et cetera? Is that built in from the outset as people are looking at this, or is it a free-for-all, or is it so overly controlled and used by the government that people don't have access? And these very important conversations can occur in international governments. They can occur at the UN, which they have. My team was involved in the first UN resolution on safe, trustworthy, and secure AI. We were involved in the G7 Hiroshima process that was just discussed. So there's all of this, but what we decided to do was rather than say, here's the top-down approach, we said, okay, let's work with the companies, let's work with people thinking about ethics, let's work with UNESCO, let's work with everybody and think about some values and then infuse that through the process and make sure that countries, whether they're in Africa, Europe, Asia, the United States, we can all think about this together and we can think about how we can use AI to solve the Sustainable Development Goals. There's a reason over the last 2 UN high-level weeks why we hosted events that were focused on this question of AI for good, AI to address the Sustainable Development Goals, rather than spending all of our time talking about AI for bad. I feel like sometimes internationally we spend all of our time talking about AI for bad, the surveillance concerns, which are incredibly important, but people do want to talk about how you can have AI that works for societies, for the people, and not just for the government. So that's the conversations we're having internationally. We're bringing together gatherings. We've worked on AI in the US government for so many years, and now we're just trying to build that out with the new generation of AI tools that are out there.
That's great. That's a great conversation then to bring Maria Grazia in. People look to international institutions, multilateral institutions like UNESCO for AI policy. Why is it so important to have these conversations in multilateral ways now?
Because complex issues like AI, you put it really clearly, it's a lot of implication for many stakeholders, cannot really be held in a inward-looking type of fashion by one country. You need really a multi-stakeholder discussion, and a discussion that goes with as many countries as possible. We were chatting before, and it was like, would you really like to have, for instance, soccer, football, college that you want, that plays by rules that are different from one country to the other? How would you have international games? How would you be able to exchange? That's impossible, right? It will add enormous costs. So take the parallel now to a technology like AI that doesn't know any boundaries by definition, by the way it is built. I really now, again, lifting the hands, I really would like to understand how many of you are conscious that whatever device you use actually has AI leveraged system in there, or uses AI consciously. Very little, because still now, for instance, there is no need to say by the time a tool has or not AI. Now, evidently, companies use it to say as a selling point, like it's an advanced system, but we're not really, aware. So the multi-stakeholder, multilateral approach is really needed also because it's one of those technologies, AI, that goes directly into foreign policies, because whatever I do at home, so to say, impacts on what you are doing or the others are doing. So that's the need of having this coordinated approach. And this was the vision that UNESCO had since a long time, because we started working on the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence already in 2019. So our member states already tasked us since that year in order to deal and come up with principles, values, and actually to address concrete policy domains. Because AI doesn't touch only the technical companies, the technological companies. It touches upon education, it touches upon labor, it touches upon, of course, privacy, as we mentioned, and for sure the environment. And let's also bring another thing on the discussion here. It has, unfortunately, a divisive potential, that is the inequalities. Unfortunately, we have tons of examples out there that tell that inequalities can either be trigger new ones or can be augmented. So we have to be really careful to understand what we want the technology to do for societies, instead of, since something is technologically feasible, should be done. And that's exactly why you have all this discussion nowadays in order to put these fantastic technologies, sets of technologies, at the service of society.
Well, let's pick up on this question of inequalities, because that's not something that was driving, say, the agenda at the Bletchley AI Summit that happened about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, here in the UK, bringing countries together to think about the frontier risks, the risks at the cutting edge of AI development, and what could be done there. Each of your organizations, countries, have taken different approaches to thinking about what solves, what kind of equalities, what kind of inequalities are being addressed and should be addressed now. I wondered if each of you might want to pipe in on, what are the principles or the documents, what have you seen that works in terms of shifting this conversation to how we get AI-empowered economies that work for everybody? Mark, do you want to start us off?
I mean, I'm hopeful that this summit that happened a year ago here and the Paris summit, which is going to happen in a few months, are very different in that. I think you start to see a lot more conversation about equality, near-term risks, all of those things. And certainly, Mozilla's worked on trustworthy AI for 5 years, and we care a lot about the near-term risks around bias, misinformation, things that have been kind of well talked about but easily left off the agenda. The piece that actually feels really important and is still not talked about when we think about inclusion and equality is who benefits economically. So if what we want to do is have AI for good or AI in the public service, really what matters is not just the what of that, but also the who and the how of that. And right now, including headlines that we were just looking at earlier, there's a few companies in the West that make the technology that people are buying. So the who and the how to going after AI, helping healthcare, solving the SDGs, tends to be for most people to go to buy from Microsoft, to go to buy from OpenAI, to go to buy from Palantir. And what that does is two things. One, certainly from our perspective as people who have worked in open source and open standards for years, it locks you in. It makes you dependent on a particular set of companies. We think that, in the end, isn't going to lead to equality and to good outcomes. But more importantly, wherever you're spending that money, and I'm Canadian, so we've seen this story before, if you're not from Seattle or San Francisco, that money is going elsewhere. And that is a really critical and under-discussed part of where we want to take the AI economy, is how do we spread the wealth? How do we build indigenous AI industries that keep the money at home? How do we build a fair global AI economy? And I worry that as we talk about regulations, we talk about ethics, as we talk about using AI for public services, we're also giving up our economic future to a very small set of players who are the biggest companies the world has ever seen. And so to us, I think getting back to how do we spread the wealth, and open source in the internet era has created, I think, $8 trillion in wealth, a recent Harvard study said, is the building blocks of spreading the wealth. And so I think we really need to look at how do we set up an AI economy that everybody can participate in and benefit from. That's a key question for us.
Jennifer.
Well, I'm going to start with the end of your answer, which is the who and the how, and take a little bit of an issue with it because, while it's true that the biggest companies currently are doing the compute and we are trying to give access to compute, most researchers think that the biggest winners on AI are not going to be a company that exists today. If you look at historical examples, there's a lot of them, and ultimately, it's not necessarily going to be Google or Microsoft that's going to figure out the application that's going to bring the benefits to economies. And what we're seeing right now is that around the world, people are building their own AI systems. They're trying to figure out how to answer the questions that they are experiencing. I mean, if you look at Africa, so they decided to do a completely different digital payment system, which was M-Pesa, which was very different than the answers we had in the United States. Similarly, if you look about AI on the questions of where do you plant crops, how do you do that, the answers and how they're doing it is very different than what you're seeing in the West. It's, again, lots of reliance on handheld devices that are not smartphones, texting, et cetera, to meet the demands that you have in those countries. So I actually have way more hope that it's not going to be further consolidation of a few players, and in fact, the wealth is going to be spread further. But then to answer your earlier question, which is how do you build those guardrails? How do you recognize that you can't just, let this into the wild without anything that sort of says, here are the left and right boundaries? Because I actually heard a lot in Silicon Valley in 2022 with companies saying hey, so it would be good to tell our engineers that they shouldn't do this. Because if we just let them do whatever they want, they're going to go down these rabbit holes that ultimately could be problematic for society. So as we were talking about, you had the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that was actually released before ChatGPT 4, to be clear. So in the summer of 2022, you had, as was noted in the video just before, the executive order from the Biden-Harris administration that talked about how the U.S. government should and should not use AI. What are the ways that the governments are doing it? It was a very, very long executive order because it sort of tried to lay out what was the appropriate use cases for governments, how to address bias, how to address discrimination, and then also gave tasks to each agency. So for example, we had to write an AI for development playbook that we just released last month as part of the UN. So I think that there's a couple of different layers to this, and what I would say is figuring out those guardrails and doing so in a way where people can have access to the technology, where people can develop the next generation of applications while still saying, here are some principles, here's some ways to do so in an ethical, trustworthy way.
Absolutely. I mean, let me get back to both of you because I think it's about the access to the technology for sure. And actually, Mark, this is the kind of discussion that we have been having in both the G7 and G20 this year, where actually UNESCO had the pleasure and the honor to be the knowledge partner when it comes to the priority AI. And we worked with both the G7 and G20 on one topic, which was, as you mentioned, for instance, the use of AI in and by the public sector. So there is a lot of awareness about the need to leverage this technology in the right way. So ethical, that means, with no disrespect to philosophers around in the room, but is very concrete, respecting human rights, human dignities, and fundamental freedoms. So really hooked and directly related to the human rights chart, right? And how to leverage it in order to improve the services that can be delivered to citizens, and also show the power of this technology to endow, society and reinforce also citizenship, democratic processes. And there was also the question of, especially in the context of the G20, the access, the endowment of the technology, the compute power, the infrastructure, the access to data, how do we use them? And actually we performed with both the G20 countries and the invited countries a kind of reduced form of what we have devised at UNESCO, which is called the readiness assessment methodology. That's an approach which we have developed with experts around the world in order to take a snapshot of where countries are. Do you have or you don't have some endowment? How you play in this? What is the governance framework that you are applying in order to steer these technologies for good? Because I think sometimes by the time people think about governments or international organizations, they think equals strict regulations. And this was your point to some extent, that is like it's going to impinge upon innovation and productivity. Well, allow me to be a bit provocative here. One of the most regulated sectors, and I mean, we are not advocating for strict regulation, we are just advocating for a governance mechanism, is the pharma sector, right? Is one of those sectors where you have procedures for everything. Do we have the counterfactual that tells us that the drugs could be developed and brought to the market to save the life of people have not been brought to the market? I'm not sure the evidence is quite there. So regulating perhaps is a strong word, but really having a governance mechanism that tells us who does what, how, and how it should be done, and perhaps what should not be done, even more importantly, is fundamental then to be able to have a common understanding of where this thing is going.
Let's pick up a little bit on this notion of governance structures, and I know Mark wants to come in because it's a step to go from we need global treaties to there's actually a rich array of governance structures that need to be developed. And I think one of the things each of you have touched on are from different perspectives, different mechanisms. But I'd love us to kind of come back and think a little bit more about those. Mark, you wanted to jump in?
Yeah, and I think certainly we are very on the train of and working very hard on good governance for AI. And I think it takes. I often get asked in the press, like, are we too late to get these governance frameworks in place? And it's like, no way. Any major technological transformation, it takes decades to figure out how you want to govern them, right? Like, we're still inventing, the right ways to regulate the automobile. And certainly, it took many, many, many decades to figure out the right traffic laws, the right safety laws. It took citizen pushback. It took just the need for commerce to have things work a certain way. So I actually think, if you think just even 5 years ago, but certainly in the last 20 in the internet explosion, governments have gotten much smarter, much more engaged in trying to figure out that we need to regulate a set of phenomena that haven't existed before. And so we're certainly very in favor that kind of we need to dig in that. And while the EU AI Act is not perfect, or the executive order isn't something that is all law, it just is a kind of laying out a plan, there's a lot of good thinking coming out in regulation. The thing I would say is what we're not seeing enough of is the idea of government as a proactive player and not just a regulating actor in this. And that's when we talk about public AI, imagining that governments, that nonprofits like the Linux Foundation or the Mozilla Foundation have a really important proactive role in defining how the ecosystem works, that there are building blocks in common, that we build towards these positive uses and not just commercial uses. And I think that's a really important piece that I guess often gets left out of the governance conversation is, if we hadn't in this country decided to build the BBC or Channel 4, what would the media landscape have looked like? Or if the Americans had not had public broadcasting in addition to commercial broadcasting. We're at that moment where I think governments need to play a role in figuring out what the public lane of all of this is, in addition to the private lane.
Well, it's also capacity building, right? And this is one of the things we do at the center that I lead, is really help think about what do we need now to help prepare societies for fair AI-empowered futures. How are we going to, what capacities do we need to be in place? And some of that is governance, but some of that is other things. And I just wanted to kind of pass to Jennifer a bit, because one of the things we saw here in the UK was the role of the US executive order. Now, for those of you who are not into the intricacies of US politics, an executive order from the White House can only apply generally to the executive branch, right? It is something that the president says. It's not law. It is an executive level set of policies that are internal to the administration and how government functions. And so how does that set international and foreign policy? Well, when a team of stakeholders that we helped lead last year looked at what capacities needed to be put in place for UK employment law to stay at the same level as it is today, with new AI tools coming online, What did we need to have to make that work? What was the first thing we picked up? We picked up the US executive order, and we said, okay, what are the definitions? What are the problems? What are the scoping? What are these kinds of ideas, and how can we think about them in our jurisdiction? So I think we need to be really creative here, because I'm just going to say it out loud. I get to say it as moderator's privilege. We're dealing with some of history's most extraordinarily financially powerful companies that we've ever seen in the history of the planet. We're dealing with companies that have this extraordinary power and are saying and acting at times that they are above the laws of any one country. How do we then come back and say, wait a second, how do we stand up for free, fair, informed societies, and societies that have the ability to set the terms of their own governance?
I mean, if you ask me, of course, being from UNESCO, it's having one set of rules that apply to the same extent to everybody. And this is why we think the UNESCO recommendation on the ethics of AI can inform the developments in all the countries, because we have 194 member countries. So how much bigger than that can the world be? So it means that then if you set the same, if you have a leveling the playing field type of instruments that allow everybody to know what are the rules of the game, it's the kind of Econ 101 type of thing that we tell the students about entrepreneurship. How do you allow a startup, for instance, to thrive on different markets? Well, if you have reduced cost of entry. So that, of course, applies also to AI. And it's even more so the case now, because you know that the alternative is being bought very quickly. By the time there is an emerging product, an emerging algorithm that seems to be extremely performing or delivering a very important service, what you see on the market is mergers and acquisitions. So if you want to have this startup world to thrive and go to the scale-up phase, which is actually, in terms of the economic dynamics, is perhaps, also from the evidence we have available, the most complicated thing to do, then you want really a competitive environment, but you also want to avoid giving whomever wants to abuse the system to have the possibility to do in some places rather than others. And that's why having one instrument that informs the policies and they are kind of coordinated by design is what could be societally optimal. And this is why also at UNESCO, we don't only work with governments, we work with all the actors that need to be around the table. I mean, let's be sincere here. There is no AI without companies. And companies are not just bad. I mean, companies need to do money and want to develop things to be sold on the markets. So everybody has to, let's say, win or gain, say it as you want, when we follow the same rule and we have this technology be leveraged for the purposes that we want it to be leveraged, avoiding the downsides of it. That can be done, especially if we do it together.
To answer your question on capacity building, I think what's really interesting is, as you talk to people around the world, especially governments, and especially governments in developing countries, but to be honest, even a little bit in the US government, I think there's this sense that they don't have the tools, we don't have the tools to actually figure out how to interact with technology companies. To make sure that you're getting a good value. What's the offer that you're getting? Is it the best one? Is it actually what you need? Or are they just trying to sell you something that ultimately you don't need? Which, by the way, I've seen plenty of companies doing that around the world. And so there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of concern, and that's about the procurement side. I'm not even going to get into the whole question of trying to create a regulatory environment, trying to create safety institutes, trying to create a regulatory institute. Getting into that is much harder, and I think it's going to be really interesting, as an outside observer, to watch the standing up and the everything that's required by the EU AI Act. I mean, I was traveling around Europe last spring and talking to really some very smart countries who were saying and now we have to stand up AI offices. We don't have the people. We don't have the people who understand AI. We don't know how we're going to do this. We're required to do this by the AI Act, and we're starting from scratch. So I think it is incredibly important to do that capacity building at the ground level, both so that governments can get the benefits, governments can contribute to the conversation about AI procurements that are going to make sense for them, AI procurements that are not going to violate privacy, and that they can feel confident that they're, negotiating on a level playing field and understanding, are they trading away their data for certain benefits? Who owns what at the end of the day? I mean, there's all these concerns that I think governments don't feel prepared to do. And that's just on the procurement side. And then you have the second side, which is the regulatory side or the safety side. And I think that as well, you need to build up this capacity. It's one of the reasons why, as we think about how you do AI safety, to also go back to Bletchley Park, we're looking at this idea of trying to knit together AI safety institutes, not to create, one overarching international safety institute, but that the safety institutes come together, share information, share best practices, see how it's working, so that ultimately we're not duplicating people's efforts, we're building off each other. It goes back to that idea that ultimately the best decisions are made if you have a diversity of voices in the conversation. So everybody's going to bring their own cultural context, they're going to bring their own abilities, and you're going to bring them together to talk about, here's what we're seeing, what are you seeing? And we're not necessarily going to have the same opinions on all of it. There will be tension, and I think that tension ultimately will get us to a better outcome.
Marco, I just wanted to comment very quickly on what you said. Indeed, there is this worry, we do notice it, and we have, for instance, a project that is supported by the European Commission that is really about endowing governments with the skills needed. Let's remember that for some time, there has been a downsizing of governments because of the cost, because there had been a period in which they had exploded in terms of the quantity of people. But now the problem is that with these new technologies, the competencies in order to understand what is right from what is wrong. I mean, they don't need to be able to code themselves, but they need to know whom they should reach out to in order to discuss and understand the issues that are at stake. So there is, on the one hand, as you said, the issue of the awareness that needs to be there. And there needs to be, and this is, this kind of awareness, whether, for instance, also in the legal system with judges or with other type of public administrators. So that is very important for them to know what are the challenges and then to know whom to go to. And also the importance, we are working, for instance, with the Netherlands in that direction. They are experimenting a lot on that side. Also to see what does it mean for supervisory authorities? How can they manage to do their work and check that what is done is the best that can be done, given also the evidence that exists and the sharing of information that can be leveraged upon.
It is almost as if that the bifurcation of science, technology, engineering, education versus everything else has done us harm in terms of where we need to be in capacity, right? We absolutely, to have an educated citizenship, to have educated policymakers, regulators, stakeholders, decision makers, we need both the technical understanding, but we also need the people who understand how societies work, how people work, what we need to do going forward. But Mark, you wanted to jump in.
And I think on that, and going back to your original question, we got these biggest companies ever. You need those things to be focused on creating wealth at home or creating wealth in places where it isn't just sitting right now. And so I think getting to that question, like how do we counteract them or have a balance of power with them, it really has a lot to do with buying at home, investing at home, and then working globally with others who are doing the same. I mean, I look at where France is trying to go and where Canada's, tried to go. I think kind of has mostly failed as two real differences in this. Canada's invested huge amounts on the science and the technology piece, and the one piece you didn't really, I don't think, include that list, is the investment in business piece, where we haven't invested. And Canada is an amazing AI talent pool for American companies. And none of that wealth is staying in Canada. There are branch offices. It's the same thing we did with the auto industry over the last century. And that actually is not how our economy should go, given the investment that we've made. And on the flip side, you see what's happening in France is really interesting. They're investing in these national champion companies like Mistral, or you have Chiate, an open source AI kind of research institute that has spun up with huge capacity, with the idea of building French industry in this space, not to like replace the American industry, but to be able to keep the jobs and the wealth there. And what's interesting is in the French strategy, open source is key to it because it's both an accelerant and a leapfrog. They can pick up what's happening elsewhere and bring it in France. And it's an interoperability piece. It's like the interoperability of soccer, is if you build open source at the core of that industry, you can be a part of a global economy.
It's almost as if these questions of what innovation is are central to thinking about what our policy should be. That innovation isn't simply or just the wealth of the first movers of the economy, but it is about how we bring others along to innovate within that ecosystem. How do we create that capacity so that we're really developing the kinds of tools that are needed on the ground, the kinds of rich, different, diverse arrays of both services and products that help everybody see that they can advantage. I mean, that's one of the hats that we wear at Responsible AI UK, which is a UK government investment in research and innovation within the Responsible AI ecosystem here. And as part of the work that we've done there, we've invested in the science, but we have now ways to try to get leaders in responsible AI research to spin out their companies, to work with companies, to bring PhD students into that kind of rich interplay. If we're having to have those kinds of incentives in the UK, it makes me concerned for what else is happening in the world, right? We know we have work to do. We simply can't leave this to the market.
And absolutely, I think we need investment policy, industrial policy, all of that has to be a part of the mix.
Jennifer.
Well, I just wanted to, give a citation for the U.S. International Cyberspace and Digital Policy Strategy, which we published in May at the RSA conference. The Secretary of State went, first time a sitting Secretary of State has ever gone to RSA, which is a cybersecurity conference, just to demonstrate how clearly important these issues are to U.S. foreign policy, since this is a panel that was partially titled When Tech Policy Becomes Foreign Policy. But the key element of our strategy is this idea of digital solidarity. The idea that, in fact, like-minded countries, countries that share values, who share a common vision of how the world should work, should come together to create these technologies. So interestingly, as a US strategy, our strategy is not only the United States, because ultimately we recognize that what's more important is this competition over values, and that we will be more successful internationally in advancing this vision if there are strong French companies, strong Canadian companies, British companies, et cetera, strong African companies, because ultimately what's more important is to make sure that AI is working for societies than to make sure that US companies are winning all the contracts. And so it's sort of this idea that we all need to come together around shared values, and that's the idea behind digital solidarity.
Well, and the shared values are partly behind a rights-based notion of thinking about a human rights-based notion of thinking about AI.
Absolutely, and this is why in the recommendation we directly link anything that is in that recommendation, which is actually very operational compared to other instruments, because we wanted to avoid the cultural relativization. So there are some values like the respect of people that shouldn't be different in different countries just because the habit of the social traditions are different. But I wanted to add to what you were saying before on a notion of the regulation, the legislation, and the policy that sometimes is thought to be always very expensive and very, let's say, costly perhaps, and difficult to implement. There are some of the things that actually leverage AI that can be done at perhaps zero cost. And let me put an example. We did some time ago a study about why women don't participate as much in the labor market and why they don't seem to go progressively high in the career as it would be expected given the skill endowment or the curriculum they have in the back. Well, it turns out that most of the job openings description has masculine type of words that puts women off. So you simply don't apply, don't see yourself represented in what they are looking for. And this is how we discovered this, well, through AI, right? Now, what can be a solution, a fix for that? It's simply a piece of law that tells you, try and avoid words like, and you put the example, that are actually clearly masculinely conveying. And why can you do that? Because we evidence we gathered clearly said that whereas women can be put off from the labor market because of that language, men can't be bothered if there is women type language. So it's not going to impinge upon the willingness, the determination, and the likelihood that men participate in the labor market or go up in the career, but it's going to actually put off women. So that's just one of the examples. The other example, and I can't agree more on the beauty of the mix, the importance in the mix, and this is also true in terms of skills. Now, I don't know how many of you have done computer science, but I haven't done computer science. I'm an economist. Nobody's perfect. But I did microeconometrics, and we were never told, for instance, to think about the environmental cost of the regressions we were running. We barely were told, like, try to check whether the data are balanced, representative, of high quality. Now, if you go and talk to people that are more into the programming of AI, very seldom they will tell you in their courses they were told to check on the quality, on the representativeness, on the coverage, because that is going to have first order magnitude effects over the kind of the prediction that AI is going to deliver. So if you have biased data to start with, you're going to have algorithms that give out bias prediction and just representative of some. Now, for instance, with India, we have started a collaboration with Nielit that trains about 1.8 million people a year on that only, in order to have in whatever coding course a slot on the ethic principles. That is like, be careful about the representativeness of the data. Think about that. By the time you do an algorithm, don't expect the algorithm only to perform, for instance, in relation to how fast it's going to give you the answer. Think about the use of the energy. Think about what this is going to entail, and so forth and so on, in order to address some of the challenges that AI brings over. And this makes basically the AI algorithms that are produced ethical by design. And again, this is not a costly, but it goes back to what you were saying, that is like, we need to have the right mix of skills and approaches together. It can't be an ex post thought, because fixing the problem ex post is not as simple.
That's right. Mark?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, one of the things that we've really pushed on ourselves at Mozilla is working with professors around the world, or groups of professors, to make undergraduate computer science more interdisciplinary. And I think that shift, and actually the State Department and USAID have worked with us a lot on that, and bringing that model from a bunch of US universities into India, into Ghana, into Kenya, into South Africa. And I think absolutely we need a different mindset. I mean, it goes back to what you said in how we take technology forward. And it can't just be engineers as engineers. It has to have that holistic view. And we have to make the multi-generational bet of changing our education systems to reflect that.
So we've got questions coming in from all of you. All of you who want questions to come in, please get them into the app now. One question that Patricia has asked from the audience is going on questions of online safety, which I think are incredibly interesting in this particular moment when we think about generative AI and the increasing capacities of audio and video generation. The question is, AI has been used for harassment, from nudifying apps that create deepfake nudes to automated stalking online. How can regulators respond? Any?
Well, I mean, I think what you've seen in the United States is less a regulatory approach than a judicial approach. I'm not going to say whether I think that's the right approach or not. I think that's just the first. I think there's an answer, which is that you can't wait. And if you wait for regulation, in fact, it's going to be so prevalent, so incendiary, that in fact it's going to be too late. So there are already laws on the books that prevent some of these things. You see in California, there's been at least one or two very high-profile cases going after some of the apps that are allowing deepfakes, particularly deepfakes of pornography. And I think the idea is you take the tools you have there, and then you will have to have regulation that's going to come under it. But there is, I think, with the idea that people are like, AI is so revolutionary, it's changed so many things, you need to have new laws. When in fact, what you find is that so many existing laws can be used to address the worst violations and the worst challenges with AI. We don't have to invent new things. You just have to make sure that you use those. And then you need to do, and this is something we do around the world, you need to make sure that judges understand it, right? What we've seen, and this is not even about AI, but online sexual harassment, right? And even in the United States, we had this problem. People would take cases to judges who just didn't get it, and so they didn't take the actions they needed to. So you needed to do an educational program with American judges, but African judges, et cetera, bench books. How do you apply the law to these new technologies? And that you can do in a much speedier fashion, and you don't have to wait for regulation.
We saw that with our UK employment law exercise, right? Taking the UK government's approach, which was we don't need new omnibus AI legislation. What we need instead is to think about this through our existing regulators. So what are the pieces that do need to be in place? And I think both that education and capacity building in terms of the quote unquote enforcers of that, but also what kinds of new definitions and what pieces can we build off of the scaffolding we already have. Mark?
And then a third thing I would add to that is the capacity in industry. We can't completely just wait for regulation. We need both those things. And it's a whole new field that most of us are unaware of trust and safety professionals. Yeah. Columbia University has like the first ever university level course in trust and safety. And so I think looking at building out that field of people who work in industry, around industry as external watchdogs. And there's an interesting project that has spun up or is spinning up as a new organization in the US right now, which is building basically a free open source stack for trust and safety, like a Linux of trust and safety, because this gets completely underinvested in. The biggest companies can get better at it. I think they actually have. But when you think about actually smaller companies, it's really a tough thing for them to be able to tackle too. So I think just some of the boots on the ground capacity is also critical.
And before I bring Jennifer in, I want to just cue one of the questions on trust and safety. It's been quite popular among people in the audience. It's a devil's advocate question. How do you do governance, keeping in mind that the tech companies behind AI are much more advanced and technologically prepared to hide capacities or avoid regulations? So I'm not cueing that for Jennifer to ask, but just as we're thinking about building up that trust and safety capacity within companies, how do we also think about how you govern when the capacity, the technological capacity, may be in the balance of companies rather than others?
Well, the thing I was going to comment on is one of the challenges that the smaller companies have at least expressed to me is that due to anti-competition law in the United States, their ability to actually share information is very limited. And I think that is something that's a concern. How can you build up the ability to figure out how companies can work together without becoming, monopolistic, anti-competitive, things like that. And I think it is something that really does need to be thought about, because you don't want a situation where the only companies that have trust and safety or like strong trust and safety organizations are the biggest companies. I think that is and so I'm interested in this, platform and other ways that information can be shared. I think, I don't know how to answer the question of hiding. I guess this comes down to a fundamental question of, trust, right? Are we starting with the idea that these companies, all they really want to do is hide what they're doing? Are you starting with the idea that they are partners in this technological revolution, recognizing that if they build a product that has so many internal flaws to it, ultimately that product is not going to be able to win the day? I mean, I would argue that, trust and safety organizations have not built up in these companies just because of, they're trying to do the right thing. I think there's a market demand that they either build up or people are going to go to other systems where they feel like their kids will be protected, their information will be protected, et cetera. So I guess in a very American way, I still believe in the market-driven economics of some of these things.
Well, I think there is a market demand for it, and it also is a moat. Right? They can keep the smaller players out because they can be good at something the market wants, which is also capitalism. Yeah. I think one of the things there's great evidence, we've had some researchers work on this, is where there isn't a big or wealthy market, then they do much more poorly at trust and safety. And so in smaller markets, mostly in the global south, deep underinvestment in trust and safety, problems with elections, all of those kind of things. So I think the market can be helpful in some of that. It may then also create an anti-competitive moat, and it may leave some countries really unsupported.
Well, I hear a lot on that last one. Everywhere I go, the smaller markets do say this to us. It's one of the reasons. So I just came here from, there was a conference through the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in Milan on information integrity, right? Because, and we worked very hard, we co-chaired their information integrity hub, because of the idea that there needs to be a recommendation out there. There needs to be a way that even smaller markets can ensure that there is a good information environment. And yes, it's something we hear all the time, and it's something I push actually with the larger companies. Like, you cannot avoid these small markets. You can't just say, well, because this market is so small, we're just going to underinvest. I think it is a major challenge, and it's one that we as diplomats try to push on.
I may add on that. I mean, the trust in the technology point, I think, is a fundamental one. Let's remember that this is a technology that is really in need of data. By the time we start not trusting the technology, we are going to be able, also thanks to some of the regulation or legislation that exists, to say, no, don't use my data, right? Now, what happens? Then the business in the back becomes much less profitable and performing, because the more the bias the data, the more work you have to do in order to have predictions that are good. So let's say it's a trust issue, but it's also something that, to be the devil's advocate of the devil advocate, the companies really don't have a big interest in, because it will just complicate matters on their side. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second is, there is, and I mean, Antonio is going to present later, voluntary disclosures can go a long way. Sometimes, by the time we talk about recommendations or voluntary disclosures initiatives, people say they don't have teeth, because, of course, it's not compulsory to abide by them. But having some of the first in the class, the one that are really want to leverage that kind of business approach that is based on openness, disclosure, display what they do, puts automatically the others that are not doing it at the question, also in front of the investors, of what, are you not telling me? What are you doing not right that you're trying to hide? So there is this imitation behavior that is triggered. So perhaps it's not as immediate as a legislation would be, like, okay, you have to do this, fine, and you have to do this within a certain time frame, but it can be very powerful.
With indulgence of the stage manager, we've got just a minute or two left. I would love to ask this smart panel, if we've got one thing in the next 12 months we need to see done in AI governance, what do we push for? And I'll start. I think we have to push for more worker voice in ensuring that we get AI right in workplaces. Quick answer.
Implementation. We have the parameters, we have the values, we have even, global approaches. Let's implement. Let's not waste time continuing to discuss what are the principles behind.
We've got the principles. Let's go. Let's implement.
I would say we should stop chasing our tail on the UN doing something and instead work from the bottom up.
Bottom up. Great.
I'm going to +1 yours on worker voice as a cheat. But I would just say, the follow-on to Bletchley Park, which is happening in Paris in February, the coming out of that, governments are not just looking at sort of weak ways to rope in companies, but are actually envisioning a role that governments can build public AI and build a public option that actually benefits everybody for the future.
I think with that, thank all of you for your attention, and help me thank the panel.